All right. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to the Mojaloop PI-11 community meeting. This is one of my favorite events, actually, in the whole cycle, and we've got really good updates. I just want to start off with a couple of announcements. First of all, my name is Simeon Oriko. I am the community manager at the Mojaloop Foundation, and really excited to have you all here. If you don't already have the link to the agenda, we have the agenda up on GitHub. A quick link to access it is if you go to your browser and type mojaloop.io/decks, that is DECKS, it will bring you to this page. And from this page, you probably should bookmark it. From this page, you can see all our agendas. A couple of things I do want to point out. Under every single agenda, we've got a bunch of links. We've got the decks for those particular presentations, and there's a link to a discussion thread. If you have any questions or any thoughts, feel free to click on that link. It will take you to discourse. For example, the upcoming session is the Level 1 Project Mojaloop Overview, API Specification, and that will take you to a nice little page there. And if you have any thoughts, any questions, or you'd like to have an ongoing discussion about any of the items presented in that session, please feel free to click the reply button and type the message and hit send. I will give you an example. And as soon as you hit reply, you should be able to see that all the speakers have been notified. They will be looking out for this, as will I. And this way we can keep the discussion ongoing. There are a couple of other links as well. We've got on the website what you need to know for the PI-11 OSS community meeting. In there, we have a link to who's who, just in case you're curious to see who's attending the session. You should have received a link on email through which you're able to fill out this form, have your picture, put in a LinkedIn, just in case you want to network and connect with other people. That would be the place to go. Zoom information, just in case you haven't registered or know somebody hasn't registered, that's a place they can do that. And a quick link to the agenda. And so with that, I look forward to a really exciting day today. Day one is essentially introduction. We have Matt Bohan, Miller Abel from the Gates Foundation, and Michael Richards, will begin the first session today with an introduction and business overview. So I'll pass that off to, I'll stop sharing my screen. I'll pass that off to Miller and Matt.
Great, thanks. Good morning, everyone from Seattle. Happy to be here with you. As folks know, this is sort of our introductory session. Really focused on all the new folks joining us for the first time. Miller, I don't know if you want to make any opening remarks before I kick into the deck.
No, just really to welcome everyone. And this is our second virtual event. We've done some learning from the last one, and we're going to bring forward those things that work really well, and we're going to try to improve those that we thought we could improve. I think we should just jump in. And Matt, why don't you start it off and hand it over to me when you like.
That sounds great. And hopefully folks are seeing my screen now. Is that correct?
Yes, we can.
Very good. So we'll give an introduction today to the Gates Foundation, the team that Miller and I are on, the Financial Services for the Poor team, or FSP as you'll hear it referred to, Level 1 principles and Mojaloop. So the goals of the Gates Foundation are really around financial inclusion, are really by 2030 will ensure that 80% of adults worldwide and 60% of folks living on less than $2.50 a day have and can use digital accounts for services beyond just P2P transfers. And that should be up from 50% and 22% of the world's population, respectively. We also aim to eliminate the gender gap in financial inclusion, which is an important part of really eliminating poverty. So kind of getting into the details of how we look at the world, you know, a guiding principle for us is that all lives have equal value. And we think a big driver of poverty and inequality is financial exclusion. There are about 1.7 billion people worldwide who lack access to basic financial services such as savings, payments, insurance, credit, etc. And it's quite expensive to be poor. You know, while these folks really do have very active financial lives, the cost of the services that they're able to access are often quite high because the system just has no idea who they are and have to treat them as, you know, risky as possible for a participant. The FSP team really supports private sector and government partners to work on these problems and try to get these financial tools out to build better, more prosperous lives. We're quite focused on digital to deliver at scale, and Mojaloop will, you know, sort of continue to be a cornerstone of that delivery and that digital delivery. And we think this is quite powerful, you know, both in terms of building wealth and building, you know, the ability to weather storms. So, according to McKinsey, allowing the folks who are not currently included, the 1.6 billion people, to enter the formal economy could add about $3.7 trillion US to the annual GDP of emerging market countries. So this is both, you know, sort of anti-poverty as well as economic growth strategy. So at Gates, we've had you know, a focus on this for a little over a decade, and you know, if we look at our numbers, we've got you know, upwards of 130 grantees just in the FSP program. You know, we're paying out about $120 million a year or so, and we're a team of about 35. So our focus countries are in Africa, Nigeria, Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya, and in South Asia, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. The way that we think about this, and it's helpful to read this slide really from the right side to the left, you know, is starting with the impacts that we want to make, right? So we want fewer people in poverty, right? And that's really what this is all about for us. And to get there, helping smooth consumption, so allowing folks to have a smoother income and manage their income with respect to financial shocks is key, and then allowing people to have the investment capital that they need in order to you know, make those small investments to improve their incomes over time. So to get there, you know, we have this idea of usage of the DFS systems. So starting with you know, really having access, which is what we've been focused on previously, to you know, really something that folks use on a very regular, almost daily basis. So having, you know, folks just have access isn't enough. It's got to be used and useful. So, and then the gender gap is another bit that I referenced. evidence really shows that money in the hands of women is much more likely to be used for household good, things like student school fees, food and healthcare for the family, investment in farm inputs and the like. So we're really quite focused on helping to get women into the system and using it, and then having a wide range of financial tools that make the system more useful and more impactful. So in order to get to that, we have what we call our payments outcomes, and it's really about descriptions of the system, right? So the system that will work will be accessible, it'll be reliable, it'll be valuable to the users in their regular day-to-day life. It'll be affordable to them, so they're not struggling to make to pay for the cost of the system, and it's profitable, or at the very least sustainable to all of those business players who are making the system available and work. And so we focus on government engagement around policy and regulation, private sector engagement, making sure that private companies can be involved and do so in a profitable way, and engaging both to create the infrastructure that's needed, which includes Mojaloop and similar systems to allow for that connectivity. So in addition to the countries that we focus on, we've also looked at regional opportunities. So making some of these systems available not just on a per country level, but across countries to regions is quite an exciting opportunity. And as we talk about scale, we know that these systems are relatively expensive to deploy, and the ability to use them across as wide a population as possible brings the cost down and makes the systems more useful. So the way that we have thought about this, and we'll read this kind of from the bottom up, as we think of rules, rails, accounts, and apps, right? So rules are the underlying regulations, governance frameworks, scheme rules that really speak to how the system will work, how the players will work together to deliver these services. And then rails, the infrastructure or connectivity, interoperability enablers like Mojaloop that live in the Rails space. And we think of these as really places for collaboration, right? There's very little that one would use to differentiate a market based on these things. So these things are cooperative space that should include shared governance and shared infrastructure. Above that, we have accounts and apps, and this is the place where we think competitive market forces really come into play to both drive innovation and drive the ability to pull market share and keep prices low and all of the good things that competition can drive. So, and to help do that, we've created and or collaborated with to cause to be created several assets and resources, and we're not alone. There's lots of sort of fellow travelers out there who are helping to drive this message and drive these assets. So obviously there's Mojaloop and the Mojaloop API family. There's this Mojaloop development community, which everybody is joining today, and we're so glad to have everyone. We've got plenty of web resources out there, both at level1project.org. The World Bank has significant content out there. The Bank of International Settlement has significant content out there. And then there are growing innovation labs. The GSMA is one that we help to provide resources for, and that has Mojaloop embedded there. So in fact, if you want to look at what a interoperable financial services ecosystem looks like with Mojaloop at the center, that's available now at the GSMA Mobile Money Innovation Lab. So there are lots of resources out there to help move this stuff along and make it a reality. So we'll talk about level one, which is kind of our infrastructure-based set of principles that we believe are most likely to create and lead to a pro-poor financial services ecosystem. And so I'll do a quick run through these just to level set. And really, Mojaloop came about as a example of a system that can and can properly support all of these principles, right? So there's really kind of two twin pillars of goals for the level one project, right? So on the left, low price to users, on the right, positively impacting the lives of poor people, right? And so in order for it to be low cost or low price to users, it's got to be low cost, and it's got to be safe. So the cost of fraud and sort of the illicit activities within the system have to be controlled and to keep the system safe, and the system has to be used. So as we talked about, the scale of the system has to be fairly large, and usage has to be fairly high in order to spread that cost of the system across many users and lots of usage. And to positively impact the lives of poor people, the system has to be useful for them. It has to do things that they otherwise want to do and bring those costs down to do so. It has to be inclusive. So, all the folks who we're talking about who are previously excluded need to be able to get into the system to use it, and then it's got to be ubiquitous, right? So when I go into a shop, or when I go to a kiosk, or when I want to send money home to my family, they've got to have the system. It's got to be there, and they've got to accept it. And so, just running through our principles here, and just about 6 slides or so on this. So bear with me. Low cost. Right? So the system has to be low cost. We think with respect to scheme design and governance, it should be run as a not-for-loss utility, and that basically means that the center, that platform, is not the place where value is accrued. It's not intended to be a place that becomes wildly valuable and profitable. The center is that cooperation space that allows for the members of the system to be more profitable and have wider business. It should be interoperable, right? So banks, mobile money providers, others in the space should be able to participate directly in the system. There should be the opportunity for those participants to own the system equally, so that there are no sort of excluded business sectors that otherwise could add value. It should allow, sort of third-party processors, so forex providers, aggregators, payments processors, and the like, to participate and add value in the system. And then for those who don't choose to be owners or who are indirect participants, there should be formal mechanisms to really get their input, understand their business processes and needs, and keep them involved in how the system works. So continuing, the system should be push payments in real time. So payments are cleared in real time and settled in the same day. Payments are irrevocable, and this is generally true of push payments, right? They need to be available for use immediately by the recipient, and short of the recipient issuing a refund or sort of legal intervention, these payments are final when they're made. These systems are working with good funds, right? So there's not significant settlement risk with respect to the payments that are made. Settlements are same day or faster. We're seeing systems out there that settle as frequently as every 5 or 6 seconds, or I think it's down to every couple of seconds with respect to the SPAY system in Mexico, and we think that definitely helps for cost by sort of freeing up capital that otherwise would be tied up in settlement obligations. Use cases for scale, right? So this has to enable use cases beyond just P2P. We think merchant payments are critical. Consumer to government, government to people, so bulk payments out for social benefit programs, employer wages, and the like, and then importantly, cash in, cash out services. So we think that will remain important for some time to be able to get cash in and cash out of the system. And then fraud management, we think shared fraud management utilities give the opportunity to both do a better job of fraud management as well as do so at the lowest cost by sharing that cost across scheme participants. So with respect to the government, we think the government should be involved in these systems through regulation and supervision. So this is not, sort of a Bitcoin-like concept where we're essentially trying to get around that. These things are used by the governments. They are, using national fiat money. They're not separate currencies of any sort. The government would be involved in licensing of e-money issuers and banks and the like as participants. And regulatorily, they should support tiered KYC, right? So this is knowing your customer, but at the kind of one end of the spectrum, you've got folks who are really just entering the formal financial system, and they might have little to no identification within the system, right? So this is really someone who can come in, self-issue a basic account, be connected to the system, make and receive small payments at relatively low velocity that creates very little risk for the system, and over time they can increase their limits and their activity through additional interactions with the system and additional presentations of identification. So the end user experience. So we're, obviously we talk about end user fees being low, even as low as 0. And, to make that happen, we think of adjacent revenue streams as being important within the space. When there are prices, there needs to be price transparency, right? So before I commit to a transaction, I need to know how much that transaction is going to cost me. And not only in fees, but in particular when looking at cross-border transactions, I need to understand the cost of less favorable exchange rates, which are the most likely that I'm able to access for a given payment. So I need to understand how much that costs. The user interface should be simple and intuitive, and be designed to prevent user errors and to prevent fraud. We think an important feature is things like showing the name of the person I'm sending money to prior to me committing the transaction. Being able to save my frequent transaction partners. Language localization. These are things that help the user to not make errors and help them trust the system and be able to use it. And even and particularly in an irrevocable payment system, that trust is just really critical. We're very committed to supporting low-cost user devices. So think the simple phones that many of us have had for years. Their interfaces to systems like this are often through USSD, and we think that's going to be important for quite a while still. While the smartphone revolution is clearly upon us, and the usage of smartphone devices in Africa and South Asia is growing quickly. The poorest users and the ones that we're most focused on will likely still use low-cost devices at fairly high numbers for quite some time. Just given the toughness of those devices and the battery life of those devices, they continue to be quite compelling for the users that we're most focused on. Access points at merchants, at ATMs, at cash in, cash out agents, bank branches, etc. It's important to have a good number of those so that folks have ready access to being able to connect to the system, present ID, get cash in, get cash out, buy goods, etc. And then importantly, notifications of my transactions should be really sent immediately just from the user's DFSP, so they can both trust them and not have three notifications in for every transaction that they make. And they should be controllable by the end user to allow them to protect their privacy and to keep their transactions, theirs. So this is particularly important for women to be able to sort of control their notifications and keep their money from being co-opted for other reasons within their households. The system design, so obviously the appropriate technologies are used to make the system secure and low cost. Identifiers should, and the directory of those identifiers should be, include but not be limited to phone number. They could be account number, national IDs, emails, and the like. Phone number can be particularly challenging again for women who might not want to share their phone number to folks that they otherwise have financial transactions with, and the system should allow for that. System components should include central platform, scheme rules, directories, settlement, fraud management, and the like. Those systems should share common cores when they can to make it low price and easily interoperable. Additional protocols like request to pay facilities, QR codes, and the like should be supported. Allowing that innovation to come in. And the system should be, connected to other domestic systems and cross-border systems to allow for, sort of that broad and easy connection. So some enabling attributes for that, that we recognize are quite important within the system. Network service and availability have to be there in order to enable these systems to work. Programs that are focused on a wide variety of folks for making sure that folks have devices, making sure that folks have the requisite education, that they're informed about these financial systems, how they work, what they can be used for, is quite important for driving uptake and usage. End user data should be kept private. It should be sort of disaggregated, but by gender, in a way that both preserves privacy, but allows for measurement and research to help us to really focus on getting to those unmet needs and unserved folks. And that is the level 1 principles in a relatively short amount of time. I'm happy to take questions on any of those kind of throughout the sessions. I'll be on and available on chat and email and the like, and participating in the discussions throughout. So questions now are welcome, but questions throughout are welcome as well. And if none pop up right away, I'll throw it over to Miller.
Thanks, Matt. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, I'm going to get my screen shared here. I can find the right one. There we go. So greetings, everyone. And thanks, Matt, for setting us up. This whole project started some years ago, and it started off, as Matt said, with really looking at what was the best way in an infrastructure intervention to improve the connectivity between individuals, to allow anyone to pay anyone. And that's really also been the core focus of Mojaloop. What we said with Mojaloop was, how can we reduce the cost of the system such that it could be deployed into a national market as infrastructure? much as we experience the roads for free, well, they're not free. They're paid for through adjacencies like taxes and service fees on large users. Most of us experience the roads as free. And so the question we asked ourselves is, could you construct a system for payments that would work like the roads for payments, the rails, and that those rails could be offered into the system at the lowest possible wholesale cost? So low, in fact, that with the appropriate volumes, that there would be no retail reason to charge for simple payments on that system. That would allow the financial service providers to focus on value-added services that they could add on top of the system. And so we started to lay out what the goals would be for this open source system. It didn't have a name at the time. This was 4 years ago when we started this open source project. And the project was set up to map the level 1 project principles onto open source software in a way that would enable the existing and new participants in the market to service their customers and the new poor customers in ways that they could not have afforded to do before. And so in doing that, we went through this process of mapping, and we had to start quickly with, well, what do we really want to do with this system? Is this a card system? Is it to connect banks? What is it for? And we identified that there really were a set of use cases that would be relevant to the poor. They'll be relevant to other people as well, but primarily to the poor. And the reach that the poor have today is through these single closed loop systems. So it's limited. Oftentimes you have to carry multiple SIM cards so that you can access multiple systems, even if you're using an advanced mobile money system. This is available in, for example, East Africa or West Africa. But if you do get to a point where you have access to more, then what could you do? What would the transactions be that you would actually want to experience? And we went through a mapping exercise to identify what those could be. And that covered what the core principles were: the ability to open your own account very quickly on a system, the ability to pay anybody, anywhere, on any system, whether they're on a bank or another mobile operator, to pay any business and to pay the government, to be paid by a business for wages, and to be paid by the government if you're entitled to receive benefits transfers. If all of those things can happen digitally, we remove huge friction from the system. And Matt touched on this point before, that it's very expensive to be poor. In order to get paid, you have to go somewhere to get the money that is paid to you. Whether that's a bank branch, which, if you're a poor person, you're really not that welcome in bank branches. You're likely to go to an agent, and the agent will charge you a fee to pull money out of your account, but they can make cash available to you. If from that account, regardless of where you hold that, there's an agent available to do that. But you may have to travel some distance to reach that agent. So what if you did all this digitally? What if you had the ability to receive your wages or benefits transfers directly into a digital account that was a stored value account that was safe for you to use, and that really supported all of the activities that you would have used cash for, but without the requirement that you travel anywhere to pay a bill. For instance, paying your utilities, you don't have to get on a bus, travel across town or into the city, stand in line to wait to pay at a window, having had to take time off from work to do that, or time away from your family if you're managing the family. And as Matt mentioned, also, we're keenly interested in empowering women. There's been a tendency to just design for everyone. And what we've discovered is that if you design for everyone, you're designing for men. And there are unique requirements for designing payment systems for women. And to really understand that and to track that more closely, any data that we collect from the systems that we operate as the Gates Foundation, we would like that data to be disaggregated by gender so we can observe what's going on and we can observe the effects that any of the interventions that we have would be made. We think this maps well into the payment system operators' skill set as well. They should be looking at who's using their system, what the general balance is, and are there things that the scheme itself, that is all of the participants in the scheme, could be doing better to bring a better balance, a better equity to the system. Diversity of use is a consequence of everyone using the system. But if everyone uses the system, then everyone needs to have access to a set of rich use cases that are relevant to them specifically. And that's the important part of the iterative process that we want to follow, and why it's so important to use an open source method that allows us to bring diverse inputs into the design of the system. So when we looked at the Mojaloop goals, advancing the industry, as I've just talked about, as part of this, is to bring to this a set of features and capabilities, rule setting, connections between implementations, but all in the service of the individual end users. How can they actually serve in their own lives with the facilities that are provided to them by this set of rails that are collaborated on by all of the participants, financial participants in the market? It gives them some fluidity and access to these services. We want the experience for markets and broad base of implementations and prospects. The reason we want this is that we're not looking to, this isn't a disruption, right? We're not trying to disrupt the system as it is. We're trying to enable the system, to take it from where it is to where it could be. There are certain facets of the population that are excluded by each of the market actors for their own marketing reasons, because they can't afford to invest in those. Having a larger market would be good for everyone, but being able to reach and interconnect across that market is difficult. And that's why we need the broad base of implementations to think about this. There are different use cases represented here today, and that will be here this week, including those that look at cross-border remittance, those that are interested in merchant acquisition in local markets, those that serve in banks and mobile money operators in their systems. And then, of course, there will be those that actually look to operate hub payment systems like central banks and other national facilities. And I think we need the blending of those inputs to really understand where to take the system forward. Ultimately, Mojaloop is useful only as it gets used and only as it is used by those direct participants of the system. And so for it to bring value to end users, common people that are interested in experiencing digital payments, we need the full action of the full stack that Matt talked about. Super important stack that starts with the rules, that is what's enabled by regulation and what is enabled by the scheme, the rails that would sit on top of that, the accounts, that is the mobile money operators, the banks, the microfinance institutions that actually service and hold value for the customers and exchange that value through the hub. And then finally, applications, because ultimately payments are only as good as what you apply them to. And things like Gojek, Grab, Uber in other markets, and Hello Tractor in Kenya being a prime example. All of these can be enabled by payments, but they themselves are not in the payments business. Don't want to be. In fact, if you think about Uber, we don't really experience paying for Uber. It's just part of experiencing the service. Bringing that kind of contextualized payment into the system is a key function of what we think Mojaloop can accommodate through interoperability. And finally, the sharing of information. We talked a little bit about this, how we do gender research so that we can improve the access to finance by women and bring an equity there that has not been there before. And we look also at security and fraud management in an operational way that if you can see both sides of the transaction, you can do a better job of managing the security and managing any fraud that might be conducted on the system. If you can only see one side of a transaction in an interoperable world, you expose yourselves to risk that you could become the conduit for that as a participant. And of course, ecosystem development. There's a lot of things we haven't thought about. So we want to be, we really want to keep this thing moving, as we can do that. We want to think about what have we not been considering, as we go forward. So Mojaloop started back in 2016. We talked about that. We've rolled through several different phases. An API specification, which you will all be familiar with by the end of the week if you aren't already, that allows the interconnection of mobile money providers with a hub-like system like Mojaloop doesn't specifically require Mojaloop, but it's been tailored in a way to support the level 1 project principles in a payment system that supports them. Phase 2 was making that platform, after we released it to the public in 2017, to make it production ready and to bring enterprise grade capabilities to it. That's continued in phase 3, where the deployment support for Mojaloop, the joint venture of Orange, MTN, and others that is taking place in to service continental Africa with cross-border remittances. And the Bank of Tanzania, the Central Bank of Tanzania's implementation of TIPS, the Tanzania Instant Payment System that utilizes Mojaloop at its core. They're building a payment system there for their country as a national grade system. In each case, there were aspects of the open source software that you would have argued should have been in the open source as they began those projects, and it wasn't there. Well, of course, it's new software, and it needs to be developed and evolved as we go forward. Both of those institutions have added to the open source software base and contributed back their improvements to open source to make it stronger. And as that has gone on through phase 3, we then entered phase 4 at the beginning of this year to continue that support of deployments. We're reaching a point where phase 4 should end later this year, and we'll be thinking about what should happen with phase 5. We need everyone's input to this. What should be on the roadmap? This is a business question, primarily, not a technical question. There are certainly aspects of the technical platform that we will continue to improve. We're executing in areas such as performance. We have a proof of concept underway you will hear about later this week that will tell you about how we imagine we can get to pretty big scale with this software at very reasonable or very low cost. We believe this will improve the cost of operating the system in markets and therefore have an impact on end users' experience of the cost of sending payments. There are other aspects as well, cross-border settlements. We think about ISO 20022 in its use in banking environments and how we can support that with Mojaloop in a way that's appropriate to real-time payments. Not all aspects of ISO would be supported. We already have a working proof of concept that's moving towards production grade capability for integrating an ATM network with a Mojaloop hub, such that an end user on a mobile money system could withdraw cash from an ATM. All of these things need to be thought about through our roadmap work. And since May of 2021, we've now had this independent organization we call the Mojaloop Foundation, which you are now interfacing with today and this week. And as we've discovered, and as Paula will tell us more as we go forward, we've received our notification from the U.S. Internal Revenue Service, as we are organized under Delaware law, that we have now achieved the charitable determination. So Mojaloop Foundation is a U.S. charitable company dedicated to its mission. And we invite participation in the Mojaloop Foundation from anyone. And by the way, you don't have to be a member to join and contribute to the software. You simply have to show up and help us contribute in any way, whether it's through conversation on the web, during the Q&A sessions this week, or more deeply in the interacting with the software stack itself, or contributing new modules that are required by other users, and that's something that you can contribute to the system in exchange for the value that you receive from using the system. But there is also a promoter level. The promoter level is for a company. It's designed for companies or organizations that have a stake in the use of Mojaloop and want a stake. They basically want a say in how it evolves. They can participate in the technical governing board and in some of the decision making around how the roadmap maps onto the resources of the Mojaloop Foundation apply to that. And finally, we have a set of 8 sponsor members who will make sure that we have the financial resources to keep the system moving. It's got now a stable base, and that stable base will be augmented by grants from some of the sponsor members to ensure that it has the resources it needs for the foreseeable future. You're going to see more about this, so I'm not going to talk about it, but you will, in fact, you will see this pretty much in every presentation. This is a simplified version of what our Mojaloop ecosystem looks like, what our model is. There's a central system. There's a set of 4 activities that we talk about as user lookup, quote, transfer and prepare, and transfer and fulfill. and then finally the settlement. And those 4 different activities of address resolution, quotation, transfer, and settlement make up the flow of information, which of course means the flow of money through the system. The financial system itself, Mojaloop, the hub, actually doesn't take a financial position in transactions. Those are held by the individual participants, and they're traded through the system, cleared by Mojaloop, and then settled by a settlement agent. Mojaloop is the account and record keeper for this. It holds the core central truth of transfers. You notice I'm saying the word transfer, not transaction. Mojaloop doesn't care about the transaction details. It cares only about the transfer of money. That is, it says it needs to be told, who are you? Who do you want to transfer money to? That's who are you paying? And how much do you want to pay? And if it knows that information, it can clear the transaction through the system, and it can ensure that that transaction will settle. Or it can determine that that transaction cannot be cleared, in which case all parties will agree that it didn't clear. There will be no uncertainty left at the end, whether the transaction has cleared or not, and no uncertainty about who is owed money by whom. That's the purpose of the Mojaloop hub at the center. The transaction details are left to the participants. So welcome to the Mojaloop Foundation. As I can close this up briefly, I'd like to be sure that everyone understands that we are at this point live. The Mojaloop Foundation is a real thing. We have transferred our governance, if you will, over the Mojaloop open source project to the Mojaloop Foundation. Its governing board, which is seated now with 6 now and 2 are coming, sponsor members. Those sponsor members are there to ensure that the Mojaloop Foundation has a budget, staff, resources, including Amazon Web Services and others, to ensure that the community can thrive as it guides the software evolution. And very important that the technical governing board, which is the second part of the governing body of the Mojaloop Foundation, is involved in the setting of the software roadmap and managing of the Agile release program. Now, that said, the technical governing board is looking to the community to organize itself, to figure out what it should be doing, what projects should be worked on, should be brought by the community into the consensus building activity that we think of here in the convening that we've got this week, and also online and through the Slack channels and through email conversations. We want the community to drive the project forward. The technical governing board is here to ensure that mission is adhered to, that we align the work of the Mojaloop Foundation to the charitable mission of the company, and that we ensure that in the end, what we're working on will ultimately serve the poor. So we're going to keep governance lightweight for the open source contributors, but we are going to ensure that the structure and mission are aligned, and that we have the funding from the sponsors to ensure that the community has the resources that it needs to do this in a planful and world-class enterprise-supported way. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to others. Maybe there's some questions for Matt or for me on anything that you've heard this morning so far. And of course, you have plenty of time this week to bring questions forward as they gel in your own mind at any time and during any session. So we'd encourage you to do that. But thank you. And I think it's back to you, Simeon.
Miller, we have a couple of specific questions. Do you want to take them now or later?
That'd be fine if they. Let's do that.
Okay.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions
on my screen.
In the Q&A session.
Yeah. So Patrick Kizito is asking, how soon are you getting connections to local banks in Uganda?
Okay, good question. So we're, as the Gates Foundation, helping countries in East Africa and Uganda among them to understand what their options would be for use of the Level 1 project principles in the designing of real-time payment systems. What we know is that there is a East Africa community system that is desired. The region wants to have interoperability between the countries. And what they've agreed at their EAC level is that each country needs to have its own payment system in place for there to be a way to interconnect them together. As you know, Tanzania, with their TIP system, is underway at building their system. Kenya is exploring what their options are. They already have a system that interconnects their banks. And they're looking for what options might they have to expand that, or perhaps to do something different there. And Uganda is also exploring what their choices and options would be. And we're prepared to support them during that journey. The Gates Foundation directly and the Mojaloop Foundation, of course, with the members, would be encouraged to support them as well. That is the regulator in the country, and so it's important that they be able to drive this work. I would have said, as far as how fast could this occur, it often takes a bit of time to get the governmental machinery aligned around a set of principles, and then to align around a project, and of course for funding to be made available to that. So we could anticipate that this might take a year or 18 months perhaps to get a project going to a point where there could be integrations occurring with different banks. But my expectation is that this wave of interoperable real-time retail payments, which really started in London with the implementation in the UK of the Faster Payments UK system and rolled out from there. This, I think, it's taking the world over, and there's no reason why Africa can't be next on this. That is Pan-Africa, and I would expect this to happen quite quickly.
Thanks, Smita. There's another question. There are a couple of other questions in the chat. I don't know if you can see them. There's one from Rajesh Parmar. Hi, I would be interested to know how far developed conversations are with GIPS and BOG in Ghana. Do you want to take that?
I can say that we've had some discussions with participants in the Ghanaian market, specifically in the commercial space, to understand better how payments are flowing there. And we've had participation in prior convenings from folks, I believe it was from GIPS, but we'd have to look back to see. We've also spoken with the Bank of Ghana a couple of years ago. We held at the Gates Foundation in Indonesia, a RegTech event, that is to think about what technology regulators might deploy in their markets to better observe and supervise those markets. And we went through a lot of what we talk about, the level 1 project principles, over a several-day session to talk through that material. And so I'm quite sure that Bank of Ghana is aware of the level 1 project, its principles about the Mojaloop system. While I'm not aware that the Mojaloop Foundation itself has had any formal conversations yet with GIPS or with BOG, we would welcome that. We would love to have that conversation to explain what we have available if they choose to use it. And of course, to ensure that there are commercial vendors that understand that if a RFP or other form of procurement were to form, that there would be support from the community, broad support for assistance.
Excellent. There are 2 more questions. I'll just bring them up. Antete Aklilu, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. What's the reason behind not caring about specific transactions?
Oh, yeah, okay. I'm sorry. I did gloss over that, didn't I? What I meant to say there was that we would care that particular transaction types and their details can be supported by the system. That is to say that we've identified in the interface work we've done about 13 different detailed use cases, and we've worked out every aspect of the data that has to flow between the participants, and that includes, in fact, merchant payments. In fact, request to pay is currently a developing set of functionality within Mojaloop right now, and something that you could join and assist us with. We've had discussions around QR code payments as well. What we've discovered, though, early on when we developed the Mojaloop system was that the details of those transactions don't actually impact on the requirement to clear or settle. So what we think is that we'd like to get to where the transaction details are important to the participants, but not important to the hub. Now, the reason for that is that if you think about the expense of managing an open source system, it comes down to how much software you have to actually introduce into the system that has to be agreed by all the participants. Transaction types and their details tend to be pretty broad. And even where you could say, geez, it's merchant payments. Well, is it card payments, or is it mobile money payments, or is it a microfinance loan repayment or distribution? What kind of payment is that merchant payment? And so the details tend to grow a bit. So we designed Mojaloop to not care about those details for the clearing of the transaction, but what it does do is it cryptographically secures those details when they are presented and they are proposed by the payee in a merchant transaction. If they're cryptographically secured, that means that when a quotation is made during that quotation cycle between the two participants, that of the payer and that of the payee, that those details, once agreed, cannot be modified, so that Mojaloop will ensure that it will not clear a transaction against it won't clear a transfer against a transaction whose details have been modified since the beginning. It will reject that. And so the idea was to separate them, to simplify the semantics around the transfer of money, but that having those semantics then highly secured and linked to the transaction details, but not dependent on those details. That way we don't have to, once you've deployed a Mojaloop hub, if new transaction types become available, they're mapped onto the transfer functionality that's supported by Mojaloop hub. But the hub doesn't have to be modified to learn about a new transaction type. It therefore simplifies the amount of time it would take to deploy a new transaction type as it becomes available, between the participants. And as they make changes to those transaction types, there's less change that is required at the center, if any at all. That was really the reasoning behind it. And primarily, again, it's one of cost in this case of maintaining the system and managing that.
Thanks so much, Miller. I think there's one more, there are still a couple of more questions. What I'm going to ask is, Miller and Matt, if you can just jump on the Q&A and type the responses to some of the individual questions in there, I would appreciate it. And at this time, I'd like to pass it over to Michael Richards.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And we will indeed jump on the Q&A here if you send those in to us. But please, Michael is now going to talk about how transactions actually get made.
Yes. And they're going to enter the no man's land between strategy and the technical stuff. So you'll have to bear with me. If you have any questions about this presentation, then by all means ask in the session, or I would be happy to take them later offline, or you can ask in the Q&A. So let me start by sharing my screen. How's that looking?
Looks good, Michael.
Okay. Right. So my name is Michael Richards. I work for Motorspot. Well, I do quite a lot of work with the Mojaloop Foundation one way and another. I'm the chairman of the Change Control Board, which deals with the specification and changes to that. And I'm also engaged, as I hope you'll see over the course of this week, with various extensions that we're currently planning to the existing Mojaloop system. This presentation is really designed to talk through exactly what happens when a transfer is made in Mojaloop. Now, one of the things that's kind of striking to me is that this is really quite different from the way in which a lot of interoperable systems manage this. Now, a lot of them essentially have a much more centralized trust model, whereas, as I think both Miller and Matt said in their presentations, we originally started as a peer-to-peer network. And in particular, we want to be a network that's open to all kinds of different participants. So it's not just banks, it's not just mobile money systems, it's all kinds of systems. And while systems that just have banks, for instance, or systems that just have mobile money systems, the participants find it relatively easy to understand and trust each other. Where there are lots of different kinds of people, we feel that it's necessary for the system to put in place mechanisms that make it possible for very different kinds of entities to be confident that when they move funds back and forth between each other, Everything will be going to plan. There won't be any fraudulent transfers. They will be able to get paid by the senders of the transfers, and that everything will proceed in a nice low-cost way. So let me start by saying this is essentially about how the API is designed and how it works. So again, both Matt and Miller in their presentations have talked quite a lot about the user experience, how users actually experience their interaction with the system. The API is really about the connections between institutions, the institutions who represent those individual users to the system and to other institutions. So this is going to be really about how banks, mobile money systems, MFI initiatives, those sorts of people, how they pass funds back and forth. Now, some limitations. At present, we don't support transfers which require currency conversion. We're working on this at the moment, and we will be talking a little bit about that in the presentation on cross-network transfers later this week. Again, at the moment, all participants need to belong to the same Mojaloop switch. We're planning to extend that to provide ways in which participants in different Mojaloop schemes can interact with each other, and in particular, how people in Mojaloop schemes can interact with non-Mojaloop schemes. And again, we'll be talking about that in more detail tomorrow. As I've already said, the API facilitates communications between DFSPs, which we will be calling, that you'll hear that word a lot, digital financial service providers. It doesn't specify any front-end interactions with the end customer. The API doesn't. And it works on pre-funded accounts. So in order to reduce risk and cost to parties in the system, we insist that transfers should be pre-funded and that there should be liquidity cover. Again, I'll be talking about how that works in a little bit. So the API itself there's a central API, the Open API definition. That's been released. These slides are out of date. Sam's going to smack me, I know. We are now on version 1.1, which has just been released. And the management of that API is the remit of the Change Control Board. So anybody who would like to see changes to the API, new functionality added, changes to existing functionality, you should try and get in contact with the Change Control Board, or with me, or Sam Cummery, and we will be happy to take any questions that you have and to forward those questions to the Change Control Board for discussion. And we also have a roadmap at the moment, the areas where we are planning to extend the system. I've already talked about foreign exchange, cross-network. We're also extending the settlement facilities. We're introducing or hoping to introduce rules processing. There are a number of areas, and you'll hear a lot more about those over the course of this week. This is the document set. I don't propose to go through those in detail. But essentially, they are divided according to those categories, and you can find them here. I'll be uploading the presentation to the central site, so you'll be able to get that, and you'll be able to go and download all of these documents and take a look at them to your heart's content. So, general characteristics of the API. It's kind of like a REST API, but it's got flavors of something that's more command-oriented. So although it's about documents, documents which define various elements of a transfer, we also have a strong organization of sequences. So that messages have to be passed back and forth in particular sequences in order for a transfer to work correctly. So they are somewhere between REST and RPC, I think. We use HTTP, standard HTTP commands to transfer messages, and TLS, as I suppose most people do, in order to guarantee the integrity of those messages. All our services are asynchronous. For those who don't know what that means, essentially it means that when you send a message to the switch, you get something back that just says, okay, I received your message and I'll get back to you. The response itself comes back in a different message to somewhere you will have said, please send my messages to here. So that means that you don't have to keep hanging on a connection. You don't have to worry about any of the sorts of penalties of performance of having to keep connections open. Once you've sent a message and you receive notification that the switch has got it, you can just drop that and wait for the response to come back. So any processing errors are sent as a special variety of the callback, the response. So I'll be talking a little bit about that in just a moment. We use JSON as data exchange format, particularly rather than XML, largely because it's much simpler and more economical in format. And as we keep saying, these represent irrevocable financial transactions. Once a transfer has been sent or a transfer request has been sent by the payer, they can no longer influence whether or not that transfer completes. And if it does complete, then they are responsible for settling those funds with the recipient. If it turns out that a transfer has been erroneously made, for instance, if someone has specified a destination account that they didn't really mean to send it to, then that has to be rectified by a reversal, i.e. another transfer which is made from the erroneous recipient back to the original sender. And of course, because we only support push payments, the erroneous recipient has to give consent to that. We also support what's called idempotent get and post. For those of you who are not yet familiar with one of my favorite words, basically it means that if I'm sitting there with my mobile phone trying to make a transfer, I press the button that says send the transfer, nothing happens. So what do? My first response, of course, is I send it again. Now, what I don't want to do is make that transfer twice. So if the switch gets a transfer request, which is exactly the same as a transfer request it already knows about, it says, okay, I'm not going to process that one. I will treat that as if it were a request for information, and I will tell the sender what the current state of that transfer is. Now, each transfer, when it comes into the system, is uniquely identified. It's the responsibility of the sender to make that unique identification. But as long as people keep sending things with the same unique identification, they won't be double counting transfers. Just a quick look at error handling, as I said. So as you will see down at the bottom, on the left-hand side, you get, oh yes, that's right. So this is a timeout one. This shows the idempotency. You get a timeout, so you resend, it's accepted. You can then resend again if you don't hear it. You post it again, it's accepted again, but you don't get it done twice. Okay? And it's a general rule which is up to participants to enforce rather than the switch, that you should never time a transfer out unless you receive notification from the switch that it's okay to do that. And here are the errors. Now, as you can see, if I send something to the server and a processing error occurs, then I get a response, but it has a /error on the end of it. And that means it will get sent to a different endpoint in your system. So you'll be able to manage errors separately from standard success responses. Right, so now we come to look at the way in which a transfer actually works in Mojaloop. And this goes through 3 stages. First, discovery, then agreement, and finally, the transfer itself. And I'll be looking in reasonable detail at how that happens in the Mojaloop system. So, in the discovery phase, the payer discovers who to send the transfer to. Now, again, Miller said when he was talking about the objectives of the system, one of the objectives was that you shouldn't need to know who owns an account in order to send funds to it. So I shouldn't need to know, if I want to send funds to Miller, I shouldn't know which money system or bank Miller banks with, as long as I know how to identify him. Also, the Miller's DFSP will send a response to my DFSP saying who this account belongs to. Now, this is very important, particularly with when phone numbers are used to identify accounts, because sad to say, phone numbers don't include check digits, so it's very easy for people to type them in wrong, particularly if they don't have smartphones. And there have been numerous expensive problems associated with people sending funds to the wrong person in error because they typed in the phone number wrong. So now the DFSP who owns that number, for instance, or it could be anything, will send back a response saying, yes, I recognize that identifier and it belongs to Miller Abel. Is that who you intended to send it to? So that your application can pop up something that says, are you sure you wanted to send to Miller Abel? And that means I can say, oh, no, I wanted to send to Matt Bohan. I can cancel that and start the transfer again. In the agreement phase, the payer says, how much money do I want to send? The payee confirms that the account can receive the proposed transfer, which may not just be a matter of the account being open. For instance, there may be limits on the amount that can be transferred in a single transfer, or there may also be limits in the number of transfers or the amount of transfers over the course of a week or a month. If that is okay, the payee DFSP defines the terms under which the transfer will be accepted. And again, this is something which is rather different from most retail payment systems. In most retail payment systems, and particularly I think in ones that are based on ISO 20022 structures, it's the payer who says what the terms of the transfer are. In our system, it's the payee. And when the payee defines the terms, it puts a cryptographic lock on the transfer terms and sends them back to the payer. So effectively, it's take it or leave it for the payer. It can decide not to go ahead with the transfer, or alternatively, the customer may decide not to go ahead with the transfer if they don't like the fees or the exchange rate, if foreign exchange is involved. They can reject it, but what they can't do is say, I think I'll change those terms. The payee is the person who sets the terms. So finally, in the transfer phase, the payer and the switch reserve funds. The payer reserves the the customer's funds, and the switch reserves the DFSP's funds. And they can't be spent twice. So what I can't do is send 3 or 4 transfers out, and essentially, if all of them worked, I would go over my limit. The reservation means that I can only transfer funds if I have sufficient funds to cover them. The payee confirms that it is happy with the terms that it agreed, and then the payee provides the switch and the payer with a cryptographic key which confirms that the transfer is completed. Again, I'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a moment, but it's an important part of our system. So then the payee completes the transfer to the payee's account. The payer the DFSP removes the funds from the payer's account, and the switch records the transfer for use by the settlement service. So at that point, the switch says, I've recorded that this transfer was successful. The switch, as Miller said, is the authoritative source of truth on transfers and whether they've been successful or not. So once the switch records it, it is, what it's saying is that the payer DFSP is on the hook to settle those funds. Right, so let's look at the transfer model. On the left hand, we've got a payer DFSP. In the middle, we've got a switch. And on the right hand, the payee DFSP. So we start off with the payer DFSP saying, I'd like to send this amount of money to this phone number. At the moment, it doesn't say how much is involved. It just says, I want to send to this phone number. Now, we support quite a lot of different kinds of identifiers, and they are all orchestrated by a component called the address lookup service. So when this request is sent through, it will say what kind of identifier is being used. In this case, it's a phone number, or MSISDN, as we like to call it in the jargon riddled world of retail payments. So it will be sent to the correct, what we call oracle. Now, an oracle is something that resolves an identifier to a participant bank or mobile money system or MFI or whatever it might be. And the way the Mojaloop system is structured allows, first of all, oracles to work in quite different ways. And second, oracles of the same kind to work in different ways in different systems. So, for instance, if we look at something like a phone number, if a Mojaloop scheme is implemented in a market that doesn't support mobile number portability, and I think there may still be markets like that, then you can tell who owns a particular phone number just by the range that it's in, because numbers are allocated by the Telecommunications Authority in blocks. So a company will apply and say, I want 10,000 phone numbers, and the regulator will reply and say, these numbers, this range of numbers you can use. In other cases where there are mobile number portability, so I can take my SIM and use it with another company, that doesn't work. I have to know individually. Now, one of the things I could do is the GSMA provides a worldwide mobile phone number lookup service. So I could just go to there and get back from them the name of the mobile phone operator who has that number registered to them. Alternatively, I may decide to do something myself. And all of those will work completely correctly in our system. Similarly, if I have a bank account, I might say, participants, you need to keep these things up to date yourselves. And the API provides functionality to enable a participant to say, if you get an identifier with this value of this kind, then please apply to me. So for bank accounts, for instance, banks can send through saying, this account number, it's mine. Other kinds of identifier, for instance, aliases, may be set up completely ad lib. People may just want to say, I want to register Mike at Spiffy, and my DFSP will send something through to the address lookup service saying, if you get a request for Mike at Spiffy, please route it to me. And that's all that's being said here. So this provides, we think, a reasonably flexible way for individual schemes to manage identifiers in the way that's most appropriate to them. It also means that they don't have to support all of the types of identifiers that Mojaloop supports. We support about 17 altogether, but individual schemes may well decide that they want to restrict the number of types of identifier that they support. So the request goes through to the address lookup service. The address lookup service sends it to the phone number oracle, and the phone number oracle sends it back saying, it belongs to this DFSP over here, which is just as well because that's the only DFSP I've got. So the address lookup service then sends it back to the switch and says, please route it to this person. And the switch sends it on in its original form, the same form it had when it left DFSP A to DFSP B. And the question that's being asked there is, do you speak for this phone number? Now, at this point, the payee DFSP responds, and this is the API call that it uses. It uses a put that says, I'm responding to this request, and it says it's the phone number 123456, and there will be content now in that message that contains, for instance, the full name of the person whose phone number it is, and it may include other information as well, depending on the scheme. Most of the calls in the Mojaloop API have facilities to add additional information that's required by particular schemes. So we have what's going extension lists that can be used by schemes. Essentially, they're just key value pairs. They can be used to pass other types of information back and forth between parties. That goes back to the payer DFSP, and they now know that, first of all, that this transfer can be routed, and second, where to route it. So if, for instance, it had come back and said, yes, you can apply to DFSP B, but it turned out that although the number was owned by the mobile network operator who operated that mobile money scheme, nevertheless, that subscriber hadn't joined the mobile money scheme, or if they had joined the mobile money scheme but their account wasn't active, then they would get an error call. Sorry, DFSP A, the payer DFSP, would get an error call back saying, sorry, can't route it. Okay, so that is the end of the lookups. The lookup phase, the discovery phase, I'm calling it. So now the payer sends details about exactly what is required on the payment. And they use the quotes endpoint and a post to send. There's content obviously in this message that says how much, who they're sending it to, those sorts of things. That's then passed straight on to the payee DFSP. And now, first of all, the payee says, is this an account I recognize? It asks whether the account can accept this transfer. Is it suspended? Is it closed? It asks whether there are any other reasons to reject the transfer. Limits have been breached, the transfer is too big, could be anything like that. And then it says, okay, I will accept the transfer under these terms, which might include fees to be charged, commissions to be paid, and the overall amount to be sent or received. Now, we provide support for per transfer fees and commissions. So it's possible for the payee to say, okay, well, I'm happy to accept this transfer, but I'm going to charge you 100 Rand to do that. Or it might say, I will accept this transfer and I will pay you a 200 Rand commission for that. And when one of the bits of information when the payer sent the thing would be to say whether those those additions, the commissions and the fees, are to be added to the amount that the payer sends, or whether they should be taken out of the amount that the payee receives. So I can say, I want the payee to receive 10,000 Rand come what may, in which case the payer might say, well, okay, in that case, you have to send 10,300 Rand. Alternatively, I might say, well, I only want to send 10,000 Rand. Please take it out of the other end, in which case the payee would only receive 9,700 Rand. Now, Mojaloop schemes don't have to support that. And there are certainly schemes being implemented at the moment where the scheme operators have said, no, we don't want people to be able to do this because it opens the door to sweetheart deals, to people trying to price new entrants out of the market by charging them exorbitant fees, all of those sorts of things. So it's not necessary to include this, but the facilities are there. So when I define the terms of the transfer, I put a lock on those terms. Now, we've talked a lot about cryptographic locks, and this is the point where the payee does that. And the way it does it is simple enough, by signing the content of the terms of the transfer with a private key. So it does that, and it winds up with a value which we call the fulfillment. It then puts that fulfillment through a one-way hash. Now, a one-way hash basically is a publicly available service that says, I will transform A into B, such that anybody who knows what A is can derive B, but nobody who knows what B is can derive A. That's what's called a one-way hash. So they put it through the one-way hash, and it's that value, which we call the condition, that's returned as part of the agreement. You'll see why this counts a bit later on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about security now. So obviously, we're exchanging messages over the open internet. We don't use a VPN. We just use standard open internet. And that means obviously that we need to have better security than would be the case if we were working over a private network where people were able to trust each other to a much greater extent. We have 3 separate mechanisms for doing that, and each of these manages a different level of security. So we start with MTLS, mutual TLS, transport level security. And that's essentially the standard HTTPS security that you will see when you come to a lot of network sites. And essentially what that means is that every message that's transmitted is encrypted using a shared key, and it can only be decrypted by another organization in the network. All Mojaloop messages are protected by a TLS. Second, we want non-repudiability. Now this is implemented using Java Web Signatures. And essentially what this is designed to do is to say, if I receive a message that purports to be from Bank A, can I be sure that it really is from Bank A? Now, what happens is Bank A signs the content of the message and it uses a private key. This is both key fields in the header of the message and the entire body of the message. And that signature is sent as part of the message header. When I get the message, I compare that signature with a signature generated using the public key for Bank A, and I confirm that they match each other. That means that I can be sure that the person who sent me this message really was Bank A, and that nothing has been done to the content of that message since Bank A signed it. So I can be confident that it really is coming from the person I think it's coming from. And all Mojaloop messages are signed like this, except for the original discovery request. And the reason for this is that when the original discovery request was sent out, the sender didn't know where it was eventually going to be routed to. Now, one of the fields that is part of the JWS signature for non-repudiability is the destination of the message. And since the sender didn't know that at the time, that will have to be added later on. So a request for discovery is not signed for non-repudiability. Essentially, anybody who can join the network can send that request. You don't need to know where it comes from. Okay, the third part is this two-phase commit that I've just been talking about. Now this uses what's called the interledger protocol. And the way it works is the way I've described. The payee DFSP signs it using a public key, and it passes that through a public one-way hash. The result of that is returned to the payer DFSP. Now, when the transfer request is eventually issued, the payer and the switch retain the condition as they reserve funds. When the payee accepts the transfer, it returns the fulfillment, i.e. the signature on the content of the message prior to the one-way hash. And it returns that to the switch and the payer. They can then pass the fulfillment through the same one-way hash and satisfy themselves that that really was sent by the payee. And then the parties can be confident that the transfer has been completed successfully by the payee. Okay, so that means that all of the parties can be confident that the payee has said, yes, I do accept this transfer, and I have paid my customer the funds in the transfer. Okay, so the payee now accepts the transfer, and it returns the quote with the terms. This large number will be the unique identifier that the payer said, this is the identifier for the quotation request. Goes back to the payer, and the payer, when it finds that, knows that it can, that the proposal has been accepted by the payee. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the transfer will go through, because it's possible always that the account might have been suspended, it might have breached the limit between the time the quote was accepted and the time the transfer was requested. But in principle, what the payee is saying is, other things being equal, I will accept this transfer. So now we come to the actual transfer part. Now, the payer reserves the funds and sends a request saying, please transfer these funds. Here is the condition that you gave me. It also sends the content of the terms that the payee agreed to. The switch then reserves the payer DFSP's funds in its ledgers, so they can't be spent twice. And it stores the condition in the same way as the payer stored the condition. It sends it through then to the payee. So the payee, first of all, says, did I agree to this? It looks at the content of the transfer request. It checks it with its private key that it used to sign it in the first place and confirms that it did actually assent to this transfer and that nothing has been changed subsequently. It asks whether the content's changed or not. It asks whether it's still possible to make the transfer. As I said, it's possible that the account might have been suspended or a limit might have been breached. And if it can, it retrieves the hash lock and sends it back with a message that says, I accept this transfer. Here is the key. Now, the switch can ask, in the way I described just now, whether this key is correct or not, whether the fulfillment that's been sent back by the payee corresponds with the condition that it stored against the transfer when the request was originally sent. If that's okay, it confirms the transfer of funds in its ledger. And at that point, the payer is on the hook to settle those funds with the payee. It now sends a message to the payer to saying the transfer has been confirmed and here is the key. And optionally, it sends a message back to the payee to say, I have confirmed the funds. Now, it's possible that something might happen in the switch after the payee has said, here's my approval for the funds. For instance, it might have timed out, transfer might have timed out, something else might have happened. No, normally, as Miller said, we're concerned to make sure that cost is as low as it possibly can be. And therefore, we don't expect that when we're dealing with high volumes of low value payments, the payee DFSP will want to wait and check every transfer that goes through the system. But there are circumstances where they might want to or need to. Obvious things are where where the transfer will result in the payee walking away with the customer walking away with cash, or where it relates to high value goods in a store, for instance. And in those circumstances, we provide facilities for the payee to say, well, I've reserved the funds, please tell me when you commit them. And in that case, the switch will send back to the payee to say, yep, I have confirmed the funds in my ledgers, you can go ahead and pay your customer because I will make sure that the payer DFSP pays you. So at that point, the payee DFSP can credit the funds to the payee. The payer DFSP now checks that the key is correct in the same way as the switch did, and if it is, it debits the funds finally from the payer's account. And that is the route of a transfer through the switch. It might seem complicated, but as I say, it's designed to make sure that transfers can happen between very different kinds of customers, with every party being able to be confident that they really can disperse the funds securely, and they'll be confident that they will eventually be paid. Now, we talked a bit about push-only payments, and there is one particular circumstance I just want to talk about briefly here, which is the merchant request to pay. Now, we don't support anything that says, as a merchant, I can go directly to somebody's account and take funds out of it. We have to find a circumlocution for that, a way of allowing a merchant, for instance, to say, please ask your customer to transfer these funds. And I'm just going to look briefly at how that works in our system. So let's suppose that I'm in a shop. Actually, I'm not as good looking as that, but you see what I mean. The person in the shop assistant says that'll be 1,000 Rand. And I ask her to charge my phone, and I give her my phone number. The payee DFSP, the merchant's bank, then asks the switch, who owns that phone number? We go through the same lookup process as we did the opposite way round when we were looking at person-to-person transfers. And now my bank gets a message saying, do you recognize this phone number? It sends back and says, yes. And the merchant's DFSP gets a message back saying, you need to speak to this DFSP, DFSP A. And as usual, it has the customer's full name with it. So we have a special endpoint which is called transaction requests here. And essentially what that says is, I would like you to ask your customer to pay me 1,000 Rand. That's passed through to the payer DFSP. And the payer DFSP comes back and says, yep, I've accepted that request. Now what happens is that my bank can go to my application and say, I don't know, Miller's Burgers is asking for $25. Are you prepared to pay this? And I confirm, I put my PIN or whatever in to authorize the transfer, and then it goes in the normal way. So effectively what's happened is my bank has been asked by somebody else whether they will ask me to pay them. My bank has asked me, I've confirmed it. So now that is equivalent. It follows exactly the same path as if I had said to my bank, please transfer these funds to Miller's Burgers.
Not only is Miller's Burgers trustworthy, but they're fine burgers and they're worth the $25 US.
Exactly. Well, that's what I've always thought, which is why I'm happy to confirm it. And I should say, if this were not a push-only payment system, I would be happy for Miller's Burger to take funds from my account whenever they wanted to. So deep and extensive has been my pleasure at their burgers.
And of course, what he means by that is that would never happen. That's why we like merchant request to pay.
Yes, that's right. Okay, so that is the anatomy of a Mojaloop transfer. Now, have we any questions? Oh, only one. Mm-hmm. Well, yes. So this is true. It's chatty. There's no doubt about it. This interface is chatty. However, I think in the diagram that was shown earlier, if you look on the right-hand side, you will see something that we call a scheme adapter that sits between the customer, the DFSP's application, and the switch. And one of the functions, one of the many functions, I should say, of the scheme adapter is to manage on behalf of DFSP a large number of the complexities of the interactions. So that, for instance, it will allow you simply to say, I want to send 10,000 Rand to Miller and just wait for that response to come back. And if you're not interested in name discovery, and if you don't have anything else to do, all of the complexities, all of the chattiness will be taken care of in the scheme adapter, and your application will not need to worry about it. Let me know, Sudhir, if that answers your question or not. So I now go to Brian, who says, question from Michael Richards. His presentation states all participants need to belong to the same switch. How many banks or financial institutions are connected to the Mojaloop switch? And why does Mojaloop appear relatively inactive in South America? So I'm going to leave Miller to answer the last question, but I will answer the first question, which is, of course, much easier. So the answer is as many as you like, is the short answer. We are, of the two implementations that are currently in process, one, I think, currently has about 6 or 8 participants connected. Tanzania will have 60. And in principle, there's no theoretical limit to the number of participants who can be connected. The reason for this is that processing in the switch is segmented by participant. And therefore, at least in principle, it's possible to scale to any number of concurrent participants without the overall load on the switch increasing, at least intolerably. Because there are a very small number of pressure points in the system. Otherwise, things can be scaled out more or less ad lib. The pressure points are, first of all, the duplicate check, the one that says idempotency. If I send 2 identical requests to pay, only one of them should be actioned. Now, that's obviously got to be done for everything that comes in before we can decide how to process it. And the second is the liquidity cover check. And that's when a request to pay comes into the switch, it has to check that there are sufficient funds available for the sender to settle that transfer. Now, obviously, that can only be done one by one in sequence. Well, sorry, there are ways of accelerating that, but in principle, It's a sequential check which can't be scaled out. But apart from that, everything else can be scaled out. And as I hope be clear, those 2 checks are per participant. So in principle, at least, we could have any number of participants, each of which would be undertaking those pressure point checks for itself. But the fact that it was undertaking that check for itself would not require additional resources from any other participant in the system. And that's why we are confident about the system's ability to scale.
And if I could step in on that point too.
Sure.
Yes. So first on that first point, I think the question is also could be interpreted, and Brian, please correct this if we misunderstood you, as that there was only one Mojaloop switch. And in fact, that's not the case. The Mojaloop Foundation is not going to operate a switch for anyone. The Mojaloop Foundation simply operates the community. It hosts the community that develops the software that can be used by those who implement the switch. So for example, the Mowali company, the Mobile Wallet Interoperability Initiative of Orange and MTN is using the Mojaloop software in their system called Mowali. They're operating a hub on their own with their systems. As Michael said, they have a half a dozen, moving to many more participants in their markets. The Central Bank of Tanzania is also using the software completely independently of Mowali to implement a national system for Tanzania. That we do expect there to be 60 and maybe more, although 60 direct participants is probably a safe way to describe that. But there are something like 1,500 savings cooperatives and tier 2, tier 3 MFIs, all of which want to eventually be connected, and they'll probably connect through an aggregator facility, such as in the Tanzania market, that might be Umoja, BCX, or Cellcom, for example, so that the technical capacity of the aggregator can be leveraged to bring on the less technically capable, smaller organizations while still reaching the poor at the institution that they hold their money at. So each of these hubs is independently operated and used, although as Michael said, there's no reason to expect that there's a scale limit on the system. There will be a cost curve that we have to optimize. That is, as the system requires more capacity to handle more directly onboarded participants, what does the incremental cost look like? And as we think about that incremental cost, what is the number of transactions that we're going to divide that cost across? That is, what is essentially the internal cost per transaction, even if you don't charge a customer for using the system, or if you didn't charge a DFSP for sending a single transaction through the system, there's still essentially a cost per transaction for the system. And we have to be cognizant of that so that we're not implying that it's open-ended. In South Africa, the system there is being deployed by the Bankers Association of South Africa as part of the SADC initiative. And SADC, so the Southern African Development Community, includes, I believe it's 15 different countries. I might have that wrong. You can check my math. But that system is already interconnected through what's called CYRUS. It's a real-time gross settlement system that allows transactions between those 15 countries to be settled in Rand and wholesale. So now it's being added to that as a retail clearing system that allows for retail obligations at banks and non-banks to be proposed and cleared and settled across border in real time. And they're evaluating how they go about putting the live system in place. That was most likely going to be built by Bankserve Africa, who is the technical service provider to the Bankers Association of SADC, and that they will use whatever software they choose to use for that. And they may choose to use Mojaloop or they may not. The Gates Foundation's interest is whether their resulting system is level 1 aligned. And I think that's a...
The original question was actually South America, not South Africa.
Oh, my apologies. I thought I read that as South Africa. South Africa is as it is. I'll put a cap on that. South America. We've had participation from a gentleman in Adolfo from Paraguay, and his fintech company. We are interacting with the government of Colombia. We've had discussions also with Brazil and some of the other South American countries as to the state of the system. And it's quite likely that we'll see an adoption at some point between these, of these countries with Mojaloop. But because the foundation itself, the open source foundation, isn't really a sales organization, it doesn't sell into opportunities, that's left to the participants in the community to do that, to identify opportunities, to offer a solution to those opportunities that would use Mojaloop as at its core. You know, we're here as a community to support all of the implementations, whether it's commercial or non-commercial, and to make sure that the enterprises that are part of this, the systems integrators, the DFSPs, and the others that have a stake in the running system, you know, will have that ability. And Neil's reminding us not to forget that the Bahamas and the Caribbean, I think he's putting in a play that he be part of that implementation. Perhaps doesn't work from home situation. Perhaps not. Perhaps he wants to go there directly. But it's true that there are a number of countries that have expressed interest in this. Ultimately, it's going to come down to the commercial you know, entities that are represented here and that are in the systems integrations business to make these opportunities real. And we're here to support that in any way that we can.
Thank you, Miller and Michael. Michael, I see one more question in the chat, and we've got about 4 minutes to go. Do you want to quickly respond to that?
Yes. Actually, I'm thinking that might be something better, which Miller might be able to respond to better than me.
Which is that question?
All right.
This is the international remittances require connection to multiple disparate national banks and financial systems. Mojaloop is a global standard, which is great, but how do small innovative fintechs access Mojaloop? Something more similar to an open SWIFT.
Yeah, there's two opportunities here, right? One of them is to think about a company that enters into a remittance business, and there are a dozen of them now. Think of RTRP, who is a member here of the community and has been working with us on establishing the cross-border and inter-system connections from one Mojaloop system to another, and the ability to send money from a Mojaloop system to a non-Mojaloop system. Those companies that are in that business are working with us to figure out what the right connection points would be within Mojaloop. How it's actually deployed, of course, then is how it would show up to where a fintech could actually utilize it. Now, Moali could technically be called a fintech. That is what they do. Moali has taken the Mojaloop software and they've deployed it specifically for international remittances. And they've done the terribly hard work, and John Mark, who's on the call here, can talk about this, the terribly hard work of regulatory support in each market to ensure that all of these transactions that are conducted cross-border meet the requirements of the sending and receiving country, that they're not fraudulent, that they are safe and secure for the end users. And of course, that they can be conducted at the lowest cost for the participants, and therefore, with our hope, the lowest cost to the end user. But I think the question comes down to, how does a fintech get involved with Mojaloop? I think part of it is to represent the voice of the customer and to talk about, I would say, value-added services in a way that we might not be aware of. We think about the pure financial transactions, peer-to-peer, merchant request to pay, cash in, cash out, over-the-counter, bulk pay, bulk receive, bulk pay, send. All of these different use cases are really pure financial transactions. But how does Hello Tractor ensure that a payment is made to the tractor driver after the field has been tilled properly in a way that nobody has to worry about the payment so much? How do they figure that out? And then how do they interface with the system? Figuring that out right would be great. Now, Hello Tractor not only had to do that with M-Pesa in Kenya, but as they expand other markets, they're going to have to do this with dozens of other providers, one by one. So they have a stake in having a Mojaloop system deployed in those markets. We could see that an aggregator might, in fact, enter a market and say, because the national systems haven't formed something here, we want to form one on our own and create their own interoperable payment scheme that they could operate as a utility to support their own business and to support the businesses of others like them. And we could see that as another possibility as well in these markets. I hope that gets at it. I know it's probably slightly unsatisfying. I think you'd like to say you could simply get a credential and sign on and connect to Mojaloop and be able to send payments anywhere. It's just not the nature of where we are yet in deployment and adoption to see that that's possible. You know, SWIFT started off as also as a small consortium among a few banks and has expanded now to 10,000 members. But we'll have to see this develop over time as what the natural, deployment and adoption looks like in countries.
Thanks for that, Miller. We'll jump in here. Sorry, John Mark.
Yeah, I was just going to add a comment to what Miller said. If you look at what Mowali is doing, which is remittance, typically the end game is that what you call fintechs that are doing remittance are going to use Mojaloop if they're going to connect to Mowali. So that's a very direct use case for fintechs. Then when we were in Uganda and I attended High People's 40 Days for the Fintechs, there are so many use cases that came up. But just in a brief, you will find something like aggregators, which I think also Mia talked about. You have many small players who are currently using aggregators. Now, if a country like Uganda, and in this case also Tanzania, has a central switch where the smaller fintechs or smaller financial players are still struggling to get to the standard of Mojaloop, aggregator fintechs are going to have a very direct use case of bringing this ecosystem together. Then there were cases of, I think there is one use case of a company like, it's called Safe Border in Uganda, which started off with payments for transport. Now it has a wallet whereby all these borders are like motorcycles. All these motorcycle riders receive payment, do savings, do lendings. Now these small end users need to do these savings and lending with different preferred banks. So you find like Safe Border, which is now turning into a typical fintech, needs to integrate to about 10 banks just to collect the savings and to get the loans to its border riders. Now, ideally, you would expect once you have interoperability, you have a switch that uses Mojaloop. A Safe Border would actually tap into this one switch, and then it's able to do all of this for its 20,000 or so border riders. So the use cases are going to be there. It's just that as a community, when we come together, we look through the opportunities and then be able to point out how this can evolve. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that quick response, John Mark. I will end this session here. Thank you so much, Matt, Miller, and Michael for your input. We'll take a 3-minute break. Well, let me make it a 7-minute break, and we'll be back at the 10 minutes past the hour, and then Sam and Miguel, I believe, are ready to lead us through the technical overview session.